Now we're going to move into the first section of Genesis, and we're going to look at the world of the text. So we've just done the world behind, now we're going to do the world of the text. And I'm just going to look at Genesis 1 through 11. Write that down. We're looking at Genesis 1 through 11, and that's referred to as the primeval story or the primeval history. You read about that in Banstra. It's just got some really weird stories, and so we're going to start working through those. As you know, our very first story, there we go, is about Adam and Eve being exiled from the garden. So we've got creation, and then very quickly thereafter, in Genesis 3, you hear that Adam and Eve disobey God, and they're no longer allowed to stay in the garden. You're well aware of that story. You know it well by now. So the theme of the primeval history is this idea of, that we see already in Genesis chapter 3, of transgressing the boundary between heaven and earth. So Genesis 1 through 11 is your primeval history, and its theme is transgressing the boundary between heaven and earth. And we see this in a variety of ways. The very first place we see it is when Adam and Eve eat the fruit because they want to be like God. So in Genesis 3:5, they decide to eat the fruit because they want to be like God, knowing good from evil. And then in Genesis 3:22, we find out that God confirms this problem, that Adam and Eve may become like God, and says they have to leave the garden so that they don't eat from the tree of life. So you see that there's a heaven and earth, and people who are from the earth are not supposed to try to reach up to heaven to become like God. That is one of the problems here, and God tries to make sure that Adam and Eve cannot reach up to heaven to become like God. They should not transgress this boundary. Then again, in Genesis 6:4, we find yet another instance of transgressing the boundary. In Genesis 11:4, we do again. So 3:5, the serpent says, you'll be like God, so eat this fruit. 3:22, human beings might become like heavenly beings, and so they have to leave the garden. They're exiled. And then in Genesis 6:4, this is something that's maybe worth looking at. We hear this strange story about the sons of God coming down to earth and having sex with human women. And if you don't believe me, you should turn to it right now. Genesis 6:4. Maybe I should read it to you, because I'm for real. It's actually there. Now, I won't read it to you. You can look it up. Genesis 6:4, the sons of God come down and have sex with human women, and there are these warriors that are born to the women that are kind of like Hercules, except Hercules was fully God and then drank that potion, blah, blah, blah. But they're half God, half human. Oh man, Percy Jackson. I forget the name of that god. Anyway, they're half God, half human. They're called the Nephilim. The Nephilim. So that is not necessarily humans transgressing the boundary like we had up here, but we've got the sons of God, these heavenly beings transgressing the boundary and coming down to humans. That's going to be a problem. And then our final instance of transgressing the boundary is the Tower of Babel, and the way that it's expressed in Genesis 11 is that the people want to build a tower that will reach to the heavens. So once again, people are trying to transgress that boundary. Now, the transgressing of the boundary here results in expulsion from the garden, right? When they transgress the boundary in Genesis 3, they have to get kicked out of the garden, out of that good place that God created for them. Genesis 6:4 is a little bit different. When the sons of God transgress the boundary and come down, this is kind of the last straw for God. So if you look at Genesis 6:4, it leads really quickly into the very next episode. It's when God sends the flood, the great flood with Noah. And the way that I want you to think about Noah and the flood is as an undoing of creation. So it's as if God sees this transgression of the boundary between heaven and earth, and that these Nephilim are being born, and the angels are having sex with women, and God is like, this is all crazy. I am going to call redo and redo all of creation. I'm going to start all over again. So in the creation account, you'll remember that God separates water. puts it in a boundary place and doesn't allow it to come any further. So God separates water. In this account, and God also says, let's separate the water this way, let's separate the water this way. So the seas go into their areas, and there's water below the earth and there's water above. So we've got rain, and you can dig wells and water can come up. But God puts the water into its place. Now, in the Noah story, we have an undoing of all of that, because in Genesis 7:11, it says that all of the fountains of the great deep burst forth. So the water that God had put under went and came out, and the windows of heaven were open, and so the water came down. So what God did at creation, separating water from water, is undone in the flood. And lots of times when we think about the flood, we think about this cute little picture of all of these happy animals floating on like a placid lake or something. But what is actually communicated in the Bible is a little bit different from that. It's a little bit more horrifying, because God is undoing creation. So here's a brief clip for you of what's going on there. And this is from Noah the movie, but it's kind of nice how they have the geysers coming up out of the earth. So that was Noah. This is extra biblical, the fighting people so that they can't get into the ark. See, look there, the great deep is coming up from its place under the earth. God is undoing creation, allowing the waters to burst forth. There you go. Look at that. That is awesome. They did a good job with this part. The rest of the movie I didn't like very well. See the waters bursting forth and then crashing down upon. This is the opposite of what God did in creation, moving waters apart. There you go. Excitement, right? I think so. All right. So we've got this transgressing of the boundary between heaven and earth. And here after the Nephilim, God says, I'm just going to start over again, starts over again with Noah, and hopes that all of this transgressing of the boundary is going to stop. But it doesn't. Because right after the story of Noah, we've got another story. So what I want you to do is read Genesis 11, 1 through 9, and figure out how the people are going to transgress this boundary again. That'll be the exercise right below this video. So look through that and find out what is going to happen in Genesis 11. The thing that they propose to build, the people propose to build, this is going to the world behind the text, sounds a lot like what we have here. I'm going to zoom in on these. These are called ziggurats. Look at those. Aren't they cool? This is just a picture of one, like an illustration. And these were temples in Babylon that would try to reach up to the heavens. And here's just the foundation of one from Ur in ancient Babylon. So the people of God living in exile may have seen these temples that reach up to the sky and have been like, oh man, that's trying to transgress the boundary between heaven and earth. That's not right. And so we've got these ancient ziggurats that may have gone along with, may have been what the author had in mind when he or she wrote about this Tower of Babel. I'm not going to go through the Babylonian flood narrative with you because you probably read enough about it already in Vanstra, but this is yet another instance in which we've got a Babylonian narrative like Enuma Elish about Atrahasis that is really similar to our flood narrative. So what I'm going to suggest to you is that maybe, just maybe, the stories of Babel, the story of Noah, that those are not necessarily historical, but rather theological. They're telling us something about God, that people kept trying to break this boundary, and that God was like, oh, you're driving me crazy. So here, God is going to send a flood, and then over here at Babel, God is going to scatter people's languages. Troubling, right? So let's find out what, next we're going to find out what God does in response to all of that.